Hello and welcome to this game review. So we played a long game, 60 plus 30, and this is very good. And I think this game is very instructive, and hopefully you can take something away from them. So e4, e5, knight c3, and g3. So this is some kind of system. This is quite slow positional, but it's fine. Here, white's main idea is to put a bishop on this kind of bad square, but then play an eventual f4 to start some kind of King's Indian type of attack. Black plays b6, which is a bit non-standard. Usually they just develop normally, or they can also play d5 before the bishop is on g2. But okay, b6, bishop g2, bishop b7, the knight gets developed, and d3. So we have to kind of understand the strategic landscape. So black has put his bishop on b7, so we have to ask why. Right? Because is the bishop attacking e4? Well, not really. The plan is never going to be to take e4 because you can just play d3 or f3 or even ignore it altogether. So the bishop has to be open somehow, which means black wants to play d5. And then who wants to trade these bishops? Well, it seems it's black, because this bishop is a good defender of our king on the king side. So keeping in mind the move d5 is extremely important here. So you play d3, so already here, why not d4? Because one of the plans, one of the goals we have in the opening is to take the center. We have three goals. Let's remember them: to develop the pieces, castle the king, and take the center. So you're developing pieces quite well. The king can be castled kingside. It could also go queenside if you want. And to fight for the center, we need some kind of pawn breaks. So why not d4? Because now if he takes, then we have a great version of the same structure that happened in the game. This bishop is quite badly placed. The e4 pawn is not weak. You have to remember what a weakness is. A weakness is a square which is easy to attack and hard to defend. Black is attacking it twice, but it's hard to attack it for the third time. And if anything happens, at the worst case, white can play f3, though easier moves like rook e1 are better. And this knight is now going to f5. The bishop can come out anywhere. White simply has more space because of the e4 pawn against probably a pawn on d6. So d4 was quite a strong move already. Okay, d3, continuing the setup. Castles and bishop e3, and yeah, this turns out to be a bad move. And you mentioned the invitation of forking on d4, which is true. And d5 definitely should have been seen from the opponent's perspective, as d5 now successfully opens up this bishop. Also, black now has the two pawns in the center, so you gave up the center, which means the pawn can take it, right? So instead, f4 was the correct move, and you mentioned you did not like this because of bishop c5. And you also mentioned you wanted some kind of strategic ideas without calculation, but unfortunately chess without calculation doesn't exist. And here this move concretely doesn't work because this pawn is hanging, right? We just attacked it. Something like knight g4, d4, right? So instead, black could take here, right? And let's say go like this, but this also doesn't work because, well, firstly, you don't even have to castle kingside. You can castle queenside, or you can just push the pawn to d4 and then castle kingside. White has a great position with the two pawns in the center. All the pieces are developed. We will castle. The position is great. So after all, we must calculate. We cannot avoid calculation. Here, of course, bishop e3 would be a fine move if not for d5. Also, something like knight d5. I mean, knight g4 should have been considered. What exactly was your plan here? Well, we're not going to give up the bishop, right? We have to move. But worst case, he will go back. So what was the point of developing the bishop, right? Okay, d5. This we have to take. And unfortunately, now we get a bad structure. Why is this bad? Because he has the e5 pawn against the d3 pawn, so he has more space. And generally, black's best plan is usually to play c5 to add extra control over the d4 square, then put a knight on c6, and then you will not be able to tolerate this knight, so you will have to take it with one of the pieces, and then he should take it with the c pawn to control the c file. So this is a bit abstract, but I will show what I mean. So all of this happens, and the opponent should probably put his knight on d4. We should take it while the c-pawn is not there, but let's say we don't. Now after c5, at some point we will have to take it, or play c3. And if we play c3, as happened in the game, this will be a weakness. So if we take it, he should take with the c-pawn, we will move the knight somewhere, and now black has an easy plan of attacking the backward pawn on c2, as if it moves, he will capture and there will be two weak pawns. So this is kind of the strategic landscape of this structure and why we should even avoid this structure, not allow d5 so easily. But okay, now we will have to suffer because the opponent has a lot more space, our pieces are bad. This bishop is especially bad because all of the opponent's pawns are on dark squares, which it doesn't mean that he has targets, it means that our bishop is not very mobile. So rook a8, a3. So what should white do? Well, if we are statically worse, this means we must look for some kind of dynamics. And looking for dynamics here is not very easy. The engine has a few ideas, but they're quite difficult. One of them is to play king h1 with the idea of rook g1 and g4. So what's the point of this? The point is to stop f5 to get the square on e4 for a knight or a queen, something like this, and maybe even potentially push further to start some kind of attack. Still, this is quite difficult to achieve. Let's say after this, if we play g4, if he takes, then this works out, as now we have this square. But if he pushes, then he will probably get some kind of strong initiative. So this is quite a difficult position, and I think what you did is fine. We kind of have to sit and wait. Maybe we could improve the position a bit. If f5, we can get away with check and play f4 importantly before black is able to play f4. And some kind of structural changes are usually going to be to our benefit because, after all, our structure is bad, the current one. So whatever changes happen, they will usually be good for us. So a3, a6, rook to ad1. So black should play f5 at some point. He eventually does. But here, after f5, you mentioned this move. Black can now give up his bishop for this knight. He doesn't even have to. He could go here, but this makes sense. And again, black has the better minor piece. Our bishop is quite useless. The big problem is white doesn't have counterplay, because black has the ability to push the pawns on the king side with preparation, and white cannot really do anything on the queen side. Some kind of b4, c4 doesn't really do anything and just creates weaknesses. So this is why the position is more or less lost strategically. But okay, he plays knight d4, but this is a big mistake, because it allows us to get rid of this terrible bishop. So let's take it instantly. He recaptures with the d-pawn. If the c-pawn was on c5, he should be able to recapture with the c-pawn and play on the c-file, as mentioned. If he takes like this, then this doesn't really make much sense, because on the e-file there's not really much happening. And now even white is a bit better, because this bishop is blocked on all diagonals. So here black continues to have some small advantage because of his bishop against the knight, and he has ideas such as c5, c4, or f5 and playing on the king side, while white again doesn't really have much to do. So you mentioned that this was a losing move, but again this speaks to your kind of avoidance of calculation, because of course you cannot really lose because of this move, right? You can lose because of other moves. Usually the losses are because of calculation mistakes or some kind of misunderstandings, as we will see later on. So c3, I mean, yeah, it does make a weakness on d3, and maybe it should have been avoided, but at some point we should probably kick away the rook. Probably after rook fe1 or something, improving the pieces. Black doesn't have any immediate threats, so maybe there was no reason to play c3 right now. Okay, c3, knight d2, so a bit of a strange move. You said f5 was coming, so you wanted to retreat, and you were doing damage control, but if f5 is coming, well, you should be prepared to attack the weakness on e5. Right? Rook fe1. This kind of discourages f5, because now this will require a lot of protection. For example, after knight c4, or simply doubling, even d4 sometimes. So generally in chess, we shouldn't be aiming to go back. We should be going forward as much as possible. Should be brave. Knight d2, b5, rook f1. So now d4. But this was kind of a mistake. And again, this was kind of unnecessary. Of course, black will play e4, right? There's not any other good move here for black. Some kind of trades would not really benefit him. For example, here. Now, with the position open, white has a lot of squares to go to. f5 doesn't really make sense in this position, so white is doing very well. So of course he'll play e4, and now we have created a pawn majority on the queen side. We have 4 against 3, so it would make sense that we have to play over there. But it's very hard to imagine anything happening here. Can we play d5, c4? Not really, right? It's very hard to do that. Well, black has this majority on the king side, which is more dangerous because that's where our king is. So if this majority gets moving, then our king will become extremely weak. So there was no reason of playing d4. Again, black is not really threatening anything. We could just create some kind of threat, maybe queen e2. If you want to play d4, you could do it here, because now after e4 we could play f3, importantly, getting rid of this strong pawn on e4. And now black will be the one that would have to prove something, because his pawn is hanging. So instead d4, e4, black plays c5, and now he has the chance to create an actual weakness, for example like this. And now we have an isolated pawn on d4, as well as the better structure for black and the better minor piece. So here the position is quite unpleasant, though still it's not really lost. That rook f8 takes. Here he played f4. You are very happy to get this move in, and as you mentioned, it was a huge mistake. What you didn't mention is why you were happy to get this move in, because it's kind of difficult to understand. Like, why would we play f4? Well, maybe either to control the e5 square, right? What's the point of controlling the e5 square? Next, maybe to stop f4, but f4 is not really a threat, right? It could just take. So that's also not really scary. So why are we playing f4? It's kind of hard to understand, because there are no kind of pluses of the move. We gave the opponent a protected passed pawn, because usually he would have to work to get a passed pawn, right? He needs to play g5, f4, and then e3, and then he will have a passed pawn. All of this will open up his king, but after this he just has a passed pawn for free, and it's a connected, protected passed pawn as well. So now all endgames will be winning for black, more or less, because one of the white pieces will always have to make sure that this pawn doesn't queen, and if there are no pieces on the board, for example in a king endgame, this will be an easy win for black, as happened in the game, because your king will be confined to more or less this box, because he'll have to always look at this passed pawn, while the opponent's king can go here, which happened in the game. So the opponent correctly exchanges all the rooks. He offers a queen exchange as well. Mathematically e2 here, I mean e3 here wins the game, threatening this. So for example, after queen e2, after a check, we can't block because of e2. And if the king moves, well, now we can't really move anything. And white black has plenty of ways to win. One of them is to kind of attack on the king side, but the best way is just queen c2, kind of a small tactical shot, which will kind of end in checkmate or something else. After e2, the best part is after king g2 there is promotion to a knight. So this is of course hard to see, but already generally black's passed pawn is very well protected. White will never have a passed pawn, this majority will never move, so the position is more or less hopeless. But okay, he plays queen d6. This gives us a minor piece endgame, in which white might have some chances, because the knight can at least move around, maybe create some weaknesses, maybe attack something. But here king f2 was played, and this allows black to already go for a pawn endgame. After this, somehow this is supposed to be a draw, but probably because the white king can go to d4 to not allow the black counterpart to go further. But after king f7, a few moves later, the same position is no longer a draw. Here white should have looked for some kind of dynamic counterplay again, because if statically we are worse, which we are, we should be looking for dynamics. After c4, we can at least exchange some pawns, which should be beneficial since we are the defending side. Now if here, we can take, and this endgame surprisingly is not lost, because we have this kind of barrier. After this, king d2, black doesn't really have a way to win. Surprisingly, even white is winning because of a4 and the distant passed pawn. So this is an illustrative variation, but in the game, black found the correct plan, which you mentioned as well, simply going to a pawn endgame, and since there is a connected passed pawn on e4, your king cannot go back here to help. If the pawn was back on f2, all of this would be kind of fine for white, but as stands, black wins quite easily. So, quite an interesting game. Well done in playing a longer time control game, and hopefully this was useful, and hopefully you've learned a lot. So, good luck next time.